Right, folks. I've entitled this now, A Reliable Electricity Supply, the 6-month and the 6-year challenge. What is happening is that we are looking all the time at the next 6 months. What you see all over the place is, how are we going to solve the load shedding before Christmas? How are we going to solve the load shedding before there? And what one has to do right now for that is to go to a place like Kemm and say, you've got to get the EAF up. You've got to do your maintenance. You've got to take it, as you heard Jan this morning, there's enough generation capacity in Kemm to get much more out if they fix it. I understand all the problems that he mentioned. So it's maintenance. The morale is down. Much of the guys there, their morale is up as individuals, but the whole organization needs jacking up, and you need some more positive publicity for them. Not rigged publicity. You need to show the magnitude of what they have to face, and you also have to point out their guys they're trying. That's the inside of a South African power station. Many people think these things are tiny. You just go in with your spanner and you fix it. It's not like that. It's a whole different ball game when you get inside. Far more complicated. So now the public tends to imagine a quick fix all of the time. You go boom, boom, and there's a solution right now. It's not like that. You know, these solar and wind things and so on are all well and good for certain purposes, but they're not going to solve the macro problem. You find there, that's for example a solar array, that's one of them. They're not small. You can get little ones on parking lots and so on, but that's not going to drive the stuff that counts. So also, of course, you've got to take into account that it's intermittent. You only get solar power during the daytime, and for that matter, you only get it really over lunchtime. You get less than half typically before morning tea and less than half typically after afternoon tea. That has got to be taken into account. I'm coming back to that. Similarly with the wind, this also is South Africans working on cleaning the solar panels. We have a particular dust problem here. In Germany, they tend to have automatic, like windscreen wiper things with water that goes backwards and forwards. There isn't any in the Northern Cape. There's also the power ships that we've heard of. If anything, we can make them ourselves. I don't really see the need for bringing them in. What the power ship is a platform on which you have a gas turbine. The fact that it's shaped like a ship with an engine to drive it from one continent to the other, we don't need that. We can put a floating square thing somewhere if you want it, and you put the gas turbines on that. As has already been pointed out, the issue is how to get the gas continuously to the turbine, not the making of the turbine. So that I'm also a little bit skeptical about the practicalities of relying on the international gas price and keeping the supply going. So these are projected as environmentally friendly solutions. I'm very skeptical about a lot of this, because you've also got to say to yourself, where did all this come from? What started it? It all started because of this belief in climate change induced by mankind, which I'm one of the scientists does not agree that that's true. I do not believe that mankind's emissions from coal or anything else is doing anything to the climate. There are many that agree with me, but that tends to be suppressed when you look around. Now, what tends to happen as well is that the psychology plays a very big role. This is a diagram I drew, and you'll see there I've called it the factor-motion balance. And what you find there is the yellow ring, which is the E ring, that's the emotion ring. And you find, unfortunately, Greenpeace and organizations like this come out and say, if you live near a nuclear reactor, your baby is going to die. And all the mommies say, well, we can't allow that, we can't allow that. And this type of thing happens, and there's a huge emotion there where the red is thickest, and they say we can't allow it. Now, we're not prepared to listen, but no. Then you go to the scientists and the engineers. They're on the other end, the fact balance, the blue one. You say to the engineer, what's the truth? And the guy comes out with a pile of printout like this. He says, well, you see, on the 14th of last year at 16:28, there was 14 points. And he loses the audience, so they don't listen. So what you need is you've got to get decision-making in the D ring, the green ring there, and say, what is reasonable? We've got to tell the public, what is reasonable? Do you understand? So that you understand enough of the story to make reasonable decisions. That's not been happening. And that's a sad thing. So, who are the ones determining policy? The people determining policy are people like this, all right? Nuclear scientists go on television and say, listen to me. And then she goes on television and says, no, listen to me. And what happens is the people tend to listen to her. So who's determining a lot of the energy policy of the world? It's people like that chain themselves to fences and lie on the street in front of trains or whatever. Certainly at times the train should just ride over them, quite frankly. And really, when they blocked the streets in London, I saw somebody on television the other day saying how they fouled up the economy in the UK there a while ago by blocking the streets for days, and the government says, well, no, it's their human rights. We can't actually move these people. The fact that the thing's jammed up. There was a pregnant woman that didn't make it to hospital and gave birth in the car. There was some other injured person that never made it to hospital. There was another fellow on the way to his father's funeral. He missed his father's funeral because there were people exercising their rights in the street. Now, it can only go so far. I'm all in favor of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech says give your opinion, not in the middle of the road while you block everybody else. Right, so you've got to say to yourself, what is the reality behind all of this? Now, firstly, after this, what happens now too is a number of people, jeepers, we've got new ideas. Look at these new ideas. So many of these ideas have been known 100 years ago. When I was a first-year student, we knew about wave energy, we knew about tidal power, we knew about that. And those things plain and simply didn't work, often because the connection of the cable to the shore and things like this became problematic. You couldn't make them big enough. There's one now, a blowhole like a whale's blowhole that you can produce energy. You shoot the water up, and when the water falls down, it sucks air through a turbine and produces energy. Of course it is. It's dead easy to produce energy. Very easy to produce energy. What's difficult is to produce enough energy economically to make it pay. That's what counts. You can burn whiskey, pour whiskey on some cotton wool and light it, there's energy. It's not profitable. And that's where the issue comes in. Well, it depends on how much benefit there is to the staff if they get a 20% cut of it or something. But you want to say, what is realistic here? Now, let me emphasize another thing which is terribly important. There's a difference between megawatts and megawatt hours, right? Megawatts in physics is called power. That's mean what you get right now. If you look there, unfortunately, the picture is a bit small, but that motor that there is a 4 megawatt electric motor. It's about the height of a person standing on somebody else's shoulders. That means you need 4 megawatts now to make that thing turn around. If you get the stove in your kitchen, an ordinary stove like that, and you run it normally for a year, it'll use 4 megawatt hours of electricity. That's the total added up energy. It is not the power. And you're forever seeing somebody in the newspaper say, oh, there's 100 megawatts of something being added. There isn't. Particularly when they tell you this will power 100,000 houses. It will power 100,000 houses if you multiply out 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and then assume what the house is going to use and divide it all up. But it won't actually deliver that at a moment. Okay, you understand? It's terribly important. And also, there's a capital M or a little m and a capital W. These are all important. And usually in the media, they're just smeared out. M's, big M's, little m's, H's, no H's. It makes no difference. It does make a difference. It's a very serious difference. Now we're going to set the scene for a moment. Let's just set the scene and stand back, all right? We live in Africa. That is Africa there. Africa is bigger than China, the United States, Europe, and India, and the UK added together. It is big. The standard Mercator map projection is incorrect. It does not project the correct areas. That's reality. So you have to bear that in mind when you are making plans, your policy decisions, and so on for the country. That is South Africa. South Africa is the same size as the whole of Western Europe added together. We're in Cape Town. I come from Pretoria. All of South Africa's coal sits in the coal fields up there in Mpumalanga, northern KZN, and so on, where you see where I've marked the coal in there. In the far northeast of the country, that black line from effectively from Pretoria to Cape Town is the same distance from Rome to London. Now, when I was in London, I said, oh, incidentally, Coburg nuclear power station down here supplies about half the electricity to the Western Cape. So today, this whole hotel is running on nuclear power. So the other half effectively comes from the coal fields. So in London, I said, how would you like it if half of London's electricity is being drawn from Rome? I said, gee, we would never do that. It's crazy. It's far too risky. And it's the same with us. We're pulling all that power down there to Cape Town. If we double the size of the economy, we'd more than double the risk to the Cape if it's relying on the coal fields. We've got to put electricity at the bottom and push electricity from the bottom up. All right? Then look at a few other size things. There's the Karoo. Well, that's the train going through the Karoo. The Karoo is bigger than Germany. Germany's got a population, I believe, about 80 million. Whatever the Karoo is, I don't even know 1 million, but the Karoo, it's a week's walk before you find another human being. So you can't go and take areas that, well, it works there and it works. Why don't we do it? The answer is no. It doesn't work like that. We've got to be more realistic and look at ourselves, and we're not doing that. So because of those distances and so on, what happened is South African planners in like the 1970s or whenever it was started said, you know what, we better start putting electricity at the bottom or we're going to be in deep trouble in due course. So they started to plan Coburg, and Coburg was built. And there's Coburg. I took that picture on the beach myself a while back. There's Coburg sitting there, and you can do your windsurfing and lie on the beach and whatever. And that went live in 1984, one of the earliest nuclear power stations in the world, interesting, in comparison to today. And there it's run reliably ever since. And that's because we're pushing electricity from the bottom up, which we have to do. Now, let's have a look and say to yourself, that's 6 months. Let's look at 6 years. What worries me a lot is everybody saying, oh, load shedding between now and Christmas, load shedding, whatever. What about 6 years down the track? There are people now deciding whether or not to build an extension to the Ford plant, whether or not to build a so-and-so, whether or not to do things. Those international boards are sitting in their boardrooms now saying, can we rely on South Africa having electricity half a dozen years down the track? And if you say no, they say we go to Korea or we go to wherever else. We've got to now show a confidence that half a dozen years down the track, we're going to be reliably supplying these people with power, and they can come here and not feel they're going to then come into load shedding and so on. So we've got to look and say, now what? And this is difficult. So let's look towards the future, have some confidence in Africans figuring out African solutions for Africa. We can't go and wait for somebody else to come and tell us how to solve our problems. It doesn't work like that. We must be realistic. I'm not opposed to renewables. I've never been opposed to renewables. If you look at everything I've ever said in public and a lot of recordings of it, everything I've ever written, I've never knocked wind and solar and so on per se. I've never attacked the individuals as individuals. I've never referred to snake oil salesmen and all sorts of things like this. I say everybody's entitled to have a legitimate opinion. All right? Now, we have been in the battery business and the hydro business a long time. Look there. That's the Katsi Dam being built in Lesotho. That's under construction. That is a great big renewables project, a hydro project that was built and conceived in South Africa with South Africans a long time ago. Not at the time of the pyramids of Egypt, but in the terms of the modern context, that was long before the current political excitement. So you look at that and you say, okay, renewables include hydro and so on. But for much of Africa, the hydro is dicey because of the shape of the ground and the climate. I've spoken to Norwegians, I've looked at Norwegian, I've never been to have a look at a Norwegian dam, but Norway relies heavily on hydro. Norway even exports hydroelectricity to the UK under the ocean. That's why the UK so far, and getting nuclear from France, they haven't had load shedding because of that. We don't have wealthy neighbors to give us electricity. But the Norwegian dams look like this. They're between fjords, and they've got water in them, which is a constant runoff from the rain's always raining there, but also there's snow and ice. The physics of it is, you know, you've got to have a height and you've got to have a volume to give you the electricity. They've always got the height of water and they've always got the amount of water they want. So they've always got electricity. African dams are big sources like this. So it doesn't take much to have one of the big droughts we have and you lose most of the water. Just the other day, Kariba was 24% full. One day, years ago now, I was giving a seminar to a number of African countries. I said, boy, if you guys lose 10% of your power because of drought, you're in trouble. And a Tanzanian guy, you know, and he said, no. He said, look, let me show you my graphs. And he pulled them out and he said, here's a power station that lost 73% of its power from the hydro dam because it didn't rain. I thought, oh my golly. And I remember feeling a bit of a fool when it struck me to what degree you could lose hydropower in Africa, which will not happen in Norway. So then you say to yourself, right, storage, and so on comes along. The storage in the electric batteries is seriously big. But that's worrying. I don't want to knock it again either, but that's a battery, all right? It's Bishop Stortford. I've been to Bishop Stortford around that area. I haven't seen that battery. But that's what a battery looks like. I find at social occasions when you're standing with a glass of wine and a number of young ladies or something, you talk about storage. You say, what have you got in mind? No, 6 car batteries in the corner there that will run the suburb. No, it's like that. And it won't run the whole suburb. That'll give you power for an hour or something. The physics that you push energy into anything, the energy is still there. So if the energy is into that thing and the energy comes out the wrong way, that's what happens. That was the big Tesla batteries in Australia that burnt for 3 days. The battery's not, I wouldn't want to sleep next to a battery during the night, not one of those. I'd happily sleep in the grounds of Coburg for as long as is necessary, but those things are like bombs. Now, I'm not knocking them, I'm just saying that it's not easy, just build them wherever. You wouldn't want that next to the nursery school or whatever the case might be. So it's a lot more difficult to do these things. So I just say be careful. Look, this is not all tested technology and so on. So put it where it's appropriate, got no problem, but don't wave your hands and say this is the solution to everybody. Right. By the way, most of these electrical batteries are not really for supplying power during the night. They're more smoothing systems to correct for the variations in the wind and so on to try and just give you the stable power. So it's very difficult to make a big battery that will really give you electricity for a while. Don't kid yourself that you can run a country, a city, or a town on renewable energy, wind, and so on. Unfortunately, you can't. It's just reality. Just face it, okay? I'm not opposed to the solar and wind solutions, but find the solutions that work. There, for example, is one that South Africa's got again. That's the Sterkfontein Dam, the Drakensberg scheme that John also mentioned this morning. That used to be grass. I've walked across there before in the days when it was grass. Then they closed it up and put a wall, and they now fill it with water. And they pump water up from KwaZulu-Natal to the top. And then when they need electricity, they run it back down through the underground pipes. You can drive. I've driven in a bakkie up inside one of the pipes. That's a big scheme. That's effectively a big battery. That's what it is. And we've been in that business a long time. So there it is. There's me standing on top of the concrete base of a wind turbine being built down by Jeffreys Bay. They're big as well. When you go there, they're seriously large. I can tell you some stories about the construction there, but we haven't got the time, so I must just back up here. Now, have a look. There's Rinkel's nuclear power station in Sweden. There it is sitting over there, fishing village and so on. There's sort of scary ideas of, gee, there's this nuclear power station, you daren't go near. It's just not true. Right? This has been falsely propagated around the world to a huge degree, which is a bit sad. In fact, it's not a bit sad, it's very, very sad. And the extreme Greens, who unfortunately got a dedicated program to condemn nuclear and so on, have been very successful because the scientists and engineers and a lot of the authorities have just not counted the stuff. They've let it carry on. So now another green renewable energy source is nuclear power. When we get fusion right, which will happen in due course, there's endless. Even with nuclear fission, the uranium and thorium in that and the crust of the earth is enough to last you all foreseeable time, longer than between now and when the pyramids were built. So to all intents and purposes, even fission I would say is completely renewable. You can get uranium out of seawater by just processing the seawater. It's more expensive than digging out the ground, but it's there. For the foreseeable future, that means at least the lifetimes of everybody in this room, the world's going to run mostly on fossil fuels. That's reality. There's too much there. It's my opinion that we will gradually shift from fossil fuels into nuclear entirely in a century's time or something like that. Wind and solar and so on will find dedicated places to do things specifically for those purposes. Now look at this. That's the energy density, megajoules per kilogram. The ladies particularly know all about kilojoules in your cornflakes. This is the same thing. So I put there what sugar is, what coal is, and then petrol. You can see there petrol is about twice what coal is. Then look at nuclear. 76 million, as against around about 50 for petrol and about half that, 25-ish for coal. That's how much oomph there is in uranium, and why you need so little nuclear fuel, and you hardly ever refuel these things, and the nuclear lasts, and there's very little of it. So this whole nuclear waste thing is also largely false, and there's so little nuclear waste that as long as you use your brains and you're sensible, it's not a danger. No more than carrying military ammunition around, dynamite for the mines and so on. Do something dumb, it'll kill you. Use your brains, it's quite safe. As far as I said, I believe nuclear is taking over just because it's plain and simply obvious. You look at that and you look at other pictures and it just tells you. You can look up pictures like this on the internet, which I did. There are many. As motor cars, you see there's a car over there and a tram and so on. As they took over from horse-drawn things, at the time people said, oh, no, the horses are really reliable. Nothing will replace the horse. You know, there was projections done there that there was a serious problem facing London because in only a few years' time, it'll be 2 meters in horse poo, and what are they going to do about it? And that was there's papers you can look up, genuine stuff saying how they're going to handle all the horse manure in the middle of London over the next number of years. It became a non-problem because the cars took over. We're in the same situation now, where coal is slowly giving way to nuclear will come around, and in a year's time teachers will teach history in class. I say, you know what, back in the early 20s, you won't believe it, but those guys couldn't see the nuclear future. They were using coal, and they didn't realize there was a limited life on this thing or whatever. And the history teacher, the kids will say, really, they did that back then? Wow. You know, like now, he says, really, they rode horses through the middle of London. So it's going to happen. There's Coburg, our nuclear power station. There's only 2 nuclear reactors and 2 nuclear plants in the world that I'm aware of that have wild animals wandering around them like that. And it's benign. I would happily camp there for the rest of my life if need be and not worry in the slightest. I wouldn't camp next to a battery, and I wouldn't camp in the grounds of a coal-fired power station. But every time there's an opportunity to jump on it, unfortunately, people do. You hear nuclear was, first nuclear power station was the 1950s, as was pointed out this morning. The real building of nuclear was the 1970s, and I said, wow, this is taking over, until the politics intruded and put the brakes on it. So I imagine still most of the reactors in existence in the world today were from the 1970s. And those were, the very earliest ones were called Generation 1, and then by far the majority of those were Generation 2 reactors. Then we get an incident like Chernobyl, we get Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and boy did the people go to town on those in the newspaper. So then the politics climbed in and that people tried to condemn them. So now you've got all sorts of false stuff like that. That is supposed to be the radiation plume from Fukushima crossing the ocean, and you'll see going, I've marked the United States in there. I said, my golly, you live on the coast of the United States, you're getting saturated in radiation from Fukushima. That was what was said. It was completely false. And that happened. Do you know how many people died from radiation at Fukushima? 0, not 1. How many people were injured from radiation in Fukushima? 0, not 1. How much private property was harmed by radiation at Fukushima? None. How much long-term genetic effects were there? None. A few years afterwards, United Nations appointed a 28-country investigation. They looked into it. They said they find no effects genetic, no babies being born with 3 legs or anything like that, nothing. So the effect from Fukushima was nothing, okay? except for the PR value and giving people time. Oh, you remember the lessons of Fukushima? And I said, yes. It showed you it was very much more safe than anybody ever imagined. So that's what it was. The real Fukushima picture for the radiation is that. And even there, if you look at 20 millisieverts, that's an allowable dose for a Coburg staff for the year. I would have been happy to live anywhere within that plume. It looks scary even to see red and so on, but nevertheless, that was negligible in terms of the actual danger of any radiation. So we've got to say to ourselves, the reactors that are around today, by far the majority of them, were conceived of in the 1960s, built in the 1970s and so on. They're generation 2. They're old. They're old technology, but they've shown themselves to be the cleanest, cheapest, greenest, and most reliable of any power source ever, and that's true, ever. So you look at that and you say, wow. Now what's happening too is that people say, oh, look at Fukushima, you can't build a reactor now. That was stuff from the 1960s, 1970s. Back then, that was before email existed, before cell phones existed. The internet started on the 1st of January 1983, before the internet was conceived of, before there was 2-in-1 shampoo, before there was non-stick frying pans. All of that was when they built those nuclear reactors. Solar and wind is fantastic technology. I'm a physicist. I know what it takes to make those solar cells. I know what it takes to get those turbines right. It's fantastic physics. It's advanced a lot. But so is nuclear. How can you keep saying, look at solar and wind, how advanced they are? You're sure they are. They've advanced a lot since the old farmer's windmill that goes clankety, clankety, clank on the farm. But so has nuclear. You can't now look at the thinking of the 1970s and the fabrication of the 1970s. We can't do that now. You see, there's an illustration, okay? That's advertising from then. So the modern thing is a completely different ballgame. This now is Baraka Nuclear Power Station in the UAE. This is a big 4-reactor power station. The 3rd reactor of the 4 is now delivering electricity onto the grid, and the 4th one will come on soon. It was built effectively on budget and on time. And what's quite fascinating about that is it employs 150 South Africans on that plant, of which more than half are not white, by the way. The heads of all 4 nuclear reactors are bosses there are coloured guys from Cape Town, an ex-Coburg boss and a couple of others here from Coburg. The vice president engineering is a South African. The vice president who effectively runs the company had the title personal advisor to the chief executive, an Indian South African. And the South Africans virtually run the show there. And people don't know that. So we got all those guys sitting there. They contact me and say, when are we coming home to a job like this back home? So the whole crew is sitting there waiting to come home. One of the most senior guys came back a couple of months ago to Cape Town. And he said, once you've ridden the camel in the sand once, he said, the novelty wears off. He said, enough of watching all the sand. He wants to come back and look at Cape Town. So he came home. So it's a completely different ballgame. You can't judge 1960s, 1970s nuclear design and say, well, that's what it's like now. It's not. Then, as was indicated by our speaker this morning so well, South Africans sat down actually in 1993 and said, you know what, we need electricity inland. The coal is all at the top. We got a nuclear power station at the bottom, but the place is big. How do we get power like by the Free State goldfields and things like that? I was involved in that in those days, and they said, you know what, we have to build nuclear power stuff that can go on the goldfields. And that gave birth to the pebble bed reactor. That's the pebble bed design. South Africa was the first country in the world to start designing a commercial pebble bed reactor. We're world leaders in the field. We we designed that reactor and got to the point of actually ordering the pressure vessel. The pressure vessel arrived in South Africa. To this day, it sits in Richards Bay Harbour, sadly rusting apart or whatever is happening to it. Because round about then, the project was canned. Not only from here, but the year 2008 was a bad year. That was the American mortgage bond drama that occurred. That was the year that Jacob Zuma unseated Thabo Mbeki. There were a number of things that happened that went hiccup, 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 and that led to us putting the pebble bed on hold. The pebble bed was never cancelled. It was just put on hold. It lasted so long, it's still on hold. So then after that, when we realized that wasn't going to get going again, a group of individuals broke away and said, man, South Africa knows what we're doing. Let's celebrate our achievement. And they said, let's start designing a derivative of the pebble bed, and it's called the HTMR 100. And that's the group I'm now involved with. And I've got one of my colleagues here today with me out of the team that's pushing to have this financed and to get it built. We designed one that is simpler, cheaper, and faster to build than the pebble bed reactor. And it's ready to go now. There's a couple of crucial technical differences that made the thing very easy to go. And it is now designed. There is a picture of our HTMR 100 reactor. That is an actual model of an actual plan. Each one of those buildings is real. We know what's in it. It is not an artist's conception of what might be there. The reactor is that round cylindrical thing that sits there. It's on the whole plant there is on the size of a football field. The entire area in that picture is about 2 football fields, about 200 meters across the front. This is the reactor itself, and you'll find that from the red line downwards is underground. The rest of the reactor is above. There's good science reasons why you want to put the rest of that underground. And so it's actually the reactor that was designed, because with the design that happened, what we did is said, instead of taking the helium gas, there's no water involved with this, by the way. That was a big factor. I should have mentioned that. The big reactors that sit on the coastline need the ocean for cooling. We don't have any water inland. So we said, let's design a water-independent reactor. That's how come the pebble bed started off by saying we don't want to be reliant on the sea or a big dam, or even a big dam as South Africa is a little dam in comparison to Lake Baikal in Russia and things like that. You need seriously big water to run a big reactor. So that is now what the HTMR 100 looks like, just a public picture, so to speak, of the inside. There's a lot more than that. And it's a thing called the small modular reactor, and it's generation 4. The most modern big nuclear power stations that you'll find on the coast are either generation 3 or generation 3 plus, it's called. Generation 4 looks after itself from a safety point of view. With a pebble bed, and there's a chap who used to be the chief engineer of pebble bed sitting here in front of me, but in pebble bed they used to say, if the worst happens in the worst, what do you do? And the answer was, you all go to the pub down the road and have a beer and you chat about it. Because the reactor would rise up to about 1600 degrees where it would sit for a day or two, and then gently all by itself it would cool down. And the reactor was designed to take it 2000 degrees without any problem. So the whole thing will go whatever, and you'll have no Fukushima thing with stuff flowing out, and you'll still probably have the press there telling you you're all going to die or whatever. But in reality, the best thing to do is go sit in the pub and have a chat. There's nothing you can do. Just leave it alone. It was designed to look after itself. So when I was in London a while ago, I went to Rolls-Royce in London, because Rolls-Royce is coming out. Oh, they got a reactor. Rolls-Royce is obviously a good company. So Rolls-Royce showed me their reactor plan. And look at that, you see. So I said, oh, okay. Now that's very big. If you look at the size of the road there, and you think of the size of the vehicle that will go on that road, look at that thing's big. Our SMR will fit inside that building about 3 or 4 times. So then I said to the Rolls guys, what's inside there? I said, well, absolutely nothing. That's just an artist's conception. Some guy just stuck that out of his thumb. He took a Coke bottle and cut it in half and sprayed it silver or something. And that's what it is. So I said to the Rolls chaps, geez, he said, no, you South Africans are years ahead of us. We're way ahead of us. And then a couple of months ago, we've had lots of international funders phoning us, saying, can we put money into a reactor? And the guy phones me and said, have you got any chance of catching up with Rolls-Royce? I said, flip it, we're 15 years ahead of Rolls-Royce. some other guy phones me up from another country and he says to me, oh, okay, I'm interested in putting money in and I'm getting places with this funder. By the way, have you got an airfield in South Africa big enough for an Airbus to land? You know, now here we're talking about building a nuclear reactor, so on. He wants to know if you've got an airfield that an Airbus can land. Now you say, it's not his fault. It's part of our fault. We haven't told the world what we can do. We're dealing with Australians now too, and at least with the Australians we don't have any problem. They don't ask us if we've got airfields and if we know what the veld looks like and this type of thing. So our one, it looks like that, intentionally. If you want it to look all sexy, I've got an architect right now that I asked about a week ago, please make a sexy one, because people say, oh, but look at what the Rolls-Royce, glass and shiny things, and you know, and yours looks like that. I said, it's intentional. That's supposed to be a power pack in Carltonville running the mines. You can have it sexy if you like. You can cover it in glass panels and put dolphins outside in the fountain, anything you like. Just pay for it. So... But we've had, you know, I've spoken to the head of nuclear in Indonesia. You know, every so often you learn something. You think, you know, I was guest speaker in Hanoi, and I'm standing up and saying, you know what it's like in South Africa? We have all these kilometers of sand, and we've got power station there, and power lines all the way to the other side of all the sand and all this. You see, look at the problems in South Africa. Guy from Indonesia, you guys got sand, we got water. He said, Indonesia has 1,000 islands, 1,000-something islands. I thought it was 6. They've got the 4th highest population in the world. He says, we've got all these little islands. We can't run power cables between all the islands. I actually got a point there. So then he said, but that is the right answer for us, because we can put them on the islands. So we've looked into this with all the things like transport. There's transport. That's our reactor on the back of a vehicle to take it to where you want it to go. And we've now got to look and say, which we've been doing, to say this is Africa. We've got to make it work here. We've had numbers of African countries coming to us. You would have seen in the media for a while now, more and more African leaders saying, we're not going to get pushed around by guys coming with their solutions. It's time we thought for ourselves. So, yeah, that's what we want. So there's Africa. Not only is it big, but it's got all those bumps and things in it as well you've got to take into account. So look ahead for 6 years, okay? And there's wisdom from a very wise fellow, Snoopy there, telling you to look ahead. We've got to look at what we know about Africa ourselves, African wisdom, and put it together and look at the future. And there you've got to go and say, you know, there's somebody with some wisdom telling somebody who doesn't know certain things that he knows. It's a symbolic picture, but it's the truth. There's a lot of stuff that we know here. You know, you can't do that because a lion will eat you if you do that. Oh, we didn't know that. So there's a whole lot of things like this that have got to be taken into account. So early on, our clever guys, of which the gentleman is sitting opposite me is one of them, we said, you know, we better fuel this thing. So they made fuel as well. There's a fuel ball. Something like 10 of those balls will supply all the electricity for a family of 4 for 10 years in there. And that's South African design, South African made. The plant exists in South Africa where those were made. Now I've noticed the last couple of months there's lots, we're getting phone calls, we're seeing in the newspaper, oh my golly, everybody's going for small modular reactors. And somebody said, where's the fuel coming from? Ooh, guts, they say. Where's the fuel coming from? So now people are calling us, have you ever thought of the fuel? Oh, sure, we made the fuel. Really? That's called triso fuel. So we made the triso fuel. There's part of the fuel plant in Johannesburg. That's Zach Madela, a chemical engineer, proudly standing in front of it. That's also part of that fuel assembly that was made. And when you say to people who are saying, do you have an airfield where an Airbus can land? You say, we can make the fuel. They say, but nobody else can. Well, it doesn't matter, we can. And we can make the fuel. We're busy doing designs for a United States company on a new variant of the fuel. And let's blow our own trumpet and say we know what we're doing. It's time we told the world. And this is the most difficult thing at the moment. People believe Rolls-Royce. Good for them. Rolls-Royce makes jet engines and all that. Good for them. They believe. You say, we are doing it. Oh, can't be. South Africans couldn't do that. And that's a big thing that we've got to get over that hump. We did. South Africa made fuel for Coburg. That's Coburg fuel. We made it entirely, including the uranium enrichment, which we were politically forced to stop. That's Coburg fuel being low. That's completely different. That's 3.8 meter long metal assemblies. They cost currently 45 million rand each, I believe. We made fuel for the Safari reactor in Pretoria. That's different. It's also a metal thing that goes into the Safari reactor. We know what we're doing. We're proud of what we can achieve. And we must look at ourselves in an African context and say, we're within this family. Let's look at what they want and what they need. The customer is important, very important, to go out and say, what is it? Ghana, I did addressed a conference in Ghana a couple of weeks ago. They're saying, man, we need this. They're saying, look, we can't get conned into solutions that don't work for us. We've got to do our own thing. So there it is. We need power. Remember, up front, power. Okay? That's some of Elon Musk's engines running as that thing is taking off. That's power. That's energy gain now, you see. It's not multiplied by 24 by 365. That's now, otherwise the thing doesn't go. The next moon rocket, by the way, is due to launch Wednesday. If all goes well between now and Wednesday, they're going back to the moon. So luckily we've got a government attitude now that's positive. Mantashe is regularly saying over 2,500 megawatts of nuclear in the pipeline, of which 100 is dedicated to SMRs and so on. There's our reactor, again, the HTMR, the complex layout, which has all been designed, and small reactors will populate the world. That's the end of my story. I apologize if I've gone too long, have I? Feeling guilty.
You have gone a bit over the time, but you were very entertaining. Thank you, Kelvin.